To all of you, thank you for participating in, and because it's virtual, of course, feel free to slip away and have a coffee or do whatever you feel you need to do over the next hour. And in terms of, by the way, in terms of coming to Coragio to speak, I regard it as a privilege. It's something that's meaningful. And if in sharing my own experiences with you, I help you in some way, that's my motivation for doing it. I've known Peter Ord for about 25 years, a remarkably good man. I've seen his generosity to a range of philanthropic causes, which I too have supported. And so, just so you're wondering, in speaking to Coragio, I do so not as a paid speaker or anything of the sort. I do it because I hope that I can help you make a difference in your lives. I should also say, by way of explanation, as we go through this Zoom, WebEx, virtual sort of world, you see some interesting backdrops with people. And I'm in Bowral. Our family home is in Bowral. My office is in Sydney, so I've been in Bowral for a couple of months now. And my wife will not allow any of my stuff anywhere in the house except in my office or in the garage. So every square centimetre of the walls in my small office has got stuff on it. So if you're looking at these things behind me, and there's a lot more in this little room, that's why they're there. In terms of a proper perspective, and I appreciate Richard's generous remarks, but when I was leader of the opposition, my wife and I were going to a dinner, and she said, this tone on the way, is this going to be good night, or are you giving a talk? And then, the first year I was Education Minister, I was asked to deliver the Chapman oration to Engineers Australia at the Park Hyatt in Melbourne. And it was a dinner format, 500 engineers and their partners, and I've been asked to deliver a 40-minute oration. So I put a bit of work into this. I researched it and I wrote it, and I read Herbert Hoover's biography, The Life of an Engineer, by way of background, the Roeblings and the Brooklyn Bridge, General Sir John Monash, of course. And if you've got engineers in the family or the business, they're very serious people. They need to get out a bit. And so I did what I'd been asked to do. So I do this 40-minute address over this dinner. And then when I sat down, the very earnest chief executive leant over and he said, Dr. Nelson, I do apologise for continuing to eat whilst you began your speech, but your wife said I should enjoy something while you were talking. So, so that's, yeah, in fact, there's more. In fact, one, you can't see it in the frame that I'm sitting behind my desk in Barrel, but when I was Education Minister again, it was 2005, and I go along to the Highfields Preparatory School, which was in my former electorate of Bradfield in the Upper North Shore of Sydney. And it was the 60th anniversary of the school, preps to year twos. And I had been asked to officially open the library. So I go along and I do what ministers do. And then a couple of weeks later, I get 30 letters from the year twos. And one of them, a then 7-year-old, James Rowe, he says, Dear Dr. Nelson, thanks for turning up at our school. You didn't have to come. We already had the key. Then he said, you're a real comedian, but gee, your speech was long. I had a cat called Nelson, but he died. And there's a drawing of a cat in extremis. So I framed it and hung it on the wall of my office. And so then about 3 months later, I'm on a flight from Perth to Sydney, and I got up to go to the bathroom. And the pilot comes from the cockpit with the same objective. So I stepped back to let him in. And I said, he said, oh, it's okay, I'll go after you. And I said, no, it's okay, I'll go after you. He said, no, you're much more important. He said, you're my federal member of parliament. I said, you're flying the plane, I'll go after you. And then he said, no, there's more. He said, you're my son's hero. And I didn't get a lot of that. And I said, oh, really? I said, your son's hero, I'm his hero. And he said, yes. I said, how old is your son? He said, he's 7. I said, 7? He said, yes, he's got this enormous photograph of you on his bedroom wall. I said, really? He said, yes, and next to it is a letter you wrote him. We've had it framed. And I said, well, what did I write to him about? He said, you wrote him the most moving bereavement letter. He had a much-loved cat called Nelson who died. So that's the proper perspective. So one of the things I've learned now, having just turned 63, is you don't realise what you're learning when you're learning it. And the most significant ideas and the thoughts that have most challenged, changed and transformed my outlook and thinking have often come when I least expected, in random moments of quiet revelation. It's a strange thing to say, particularly to a Coragio audience, but in my experience, leadership is not something that can be taught, but it can be learned. And the qualities that inform leadership can be observed, absorbed, and reflected upon in what you see in the leadership of others, those in your immediate workplace and those in broader societal positions of leadership. And the power is in the story. Early in 2010, I had just arrived in Brussels. I was there as Australia's ambassador to the European Union, to NATO, to Belgium and Luxembourg. And the then US ambassador to the European Union, a man called William E. Kennard Jr., who chaired the Carlyle Group in the decade prior to his appointment, had come to see me at our embassy to discuss an issue of mutual concern to our countries. I went out into the foyer to meet him, and he bears an uncanny resemblance to his then president, Barack Obama, an African American. And we walked into my office chatting as you do, and he literally stopped dead in his tracks, literally stopped half sentence speaking. And what stopped him was a black and white photograph in my office on the wall opposite my desk. And he simply said, "A black man." And I said, "Yes, Bill." I said, "His name is Neville Bonner. He was the first Aboriginal Australian elected to the Australian Parliament. And he goes everywhere with me to remind me of what's really important in life and to do so every single day." And I told him the story of Neville. I said he was born in my country, on a tiny little island in the mouth of the Tweed River in northern New South Wales in 1922, Yucca Island. His non-Indigenous father absconded before his birth. He was a Yungara man, his mother, Julia Rebecca Bell. He grew up on the banks of the Richmond River, also in northern New South Wales, in a hollow carved under lantana bushes by his Indigenous grandfather. When he was 8, the year before his mother's death, she sent him to a little school in a place called Lismore, and he lasted 2 days before the non-Aboriginal parents forced him from the school. It was to his Indigenous grandmother, Ida Bell, that he attributed his ultimate success in life. Because at the age of 14, she'd insisted that he go to school, and he was resisting it. And she'd said to him, "Neville, if you learn to read and write, express yourself well, and treat people with decency and courtesy, it'll take you a long way." At Bow Desert School, in a calendar year, he did 2 years of education. He then spent his life working as a ringer, a stockman, clearing brush, a dairy hand. He spent 15 years on the infamous Palm Island off the coast of Townsville. And then in 1967, he was working as a bridge carpenter in Ipswich. And his interest in politics was piqued by the referendum that would seek to change the Constitution to allow the federal government to pass laws in relation to Aboriginal people and for them to be counted in the census. In 1971, he stood before the members of the Liberal Party of Queensland, seeking their preferment to go to Canberra as a senator for Queensland, the very first Aboriginal person ever to do so. And he said to them in part, "In my experience of this world, there are two things of which we're in great need: human compassion and understanding." He spent 11 years in the Australian Senate. He endured condescension. He was patronised. He faced racism. On one occasion, when he was presenting prizes at a Queensland school, many of the parents of the non-Indigenous children refused to have their children accept anything from him. In 1992, when Robin Hughes was doing his biography, she asked him to nominate his greatest achievement. He said, "It is that I was there." They no longer spoke, he said, of fools or blacks. They spoke of Aboriginal people. In 1994, Neville Bonner was awarded an honorary doctorate by Griffith University, and he gave the occasional address to the young graduates. And he told them another story from that year when he was 8 years old, that year that he was sent to the school in Lismore. He said his grandmother, Ida Bell, had been given a packet of porridge by the local shopkeeper, and it had weevils in it. She put it in the water to get the weevils out of it. And he said, "I was so excited. We were going to have porridge, just like white people." He said, "I knew white people had milk and sugar on their porridge." So he said, "I ran up to the dairy farmer just up the road, and I stood in front of him and said, 'Guess what? We're going to have porridge today. I came to ask if you could give us some separated milk.' He said the farmer screamed at him, 'My pigs will get that milk before you and your black people.'" Neville said to the young audience at Griffith, he said, "I'm not telling you this story to illustrate discrimination and cruelty. He said, I'm telling you because this is how I came to my goals." He said, "I decided then and there, and when I walked back to my family's humpy, that one day I would be able to eat porridge with milk and sugar every day." And he said, "Throughout my life, the discomfort, the savagery, and the racial hatred that I endured, every episode," he said, "laid a foundation for another determined goal." So I said to Bill Kennard, and I said to others, and it hangs in my Boeing office now, right opposite my desk. It's there every day to remind me of the two things that are most important. The first is the liberating power of even a small amount of education, which too often we take for granted. And the second is that transcending everything in life, rank, power, money, influence, looks, talent, is character. It's informed by worthwhile intrinsic virtues. And it's forged not by the successes that we have in our life, but the hardships that we face and how we endure them. People reveal something about themselves by what they choose to put in their workplace, as they do in our homes. So whether it's a desktop or whether people have an office, what they choose to put in it reveals something of them. And Bill Kennard, having discussed to Neville Bonner, he then went a bit further along, and there was a smaller portrait of Thomas Jefferson, first Secretary of State of the United States and the US third president. And Kennard said to me, "You've got a portrait of one of my presidents in your office, and you're the Australian ambassador." And I said, "Yes, Bill." I said, "I'm a great devotee of Jefferson's, notwithstanding his views on slavery." And in asking me why, and he bent down to have a look because there's an inscription at the bottom of it. And it's annotated by Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State in the second George W. Bush administration. And where she says to me, Brendan, education for Australia and the United States will be the defence of our nations. And I said to Bill, Jefferson's there because when he was asked toward the end of his life to nominate his greatest achievement, he didn't say, oh, being president of the United States. I mean, his mother would have said, that's great, looks good on the CV. He said, I want my life to be remembered for three things. First is co-authoring the American Declaration of Independence. The second, he said, is the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. But the third, he said, was his most important legacy. And that was co-founding the University of Virginia. And when he was asked why, after all he had done, that was the most important thing, he said, because education is the defense of the nation. And what defends us most as human beings from ideas and attitudes deeply rooted in ignorance and prejudice is education. But it isn't as simple as that. Some people lead from position. President of the company, chairman of the board, captain of the team. Some people lead from principle. They eschew position to instead pursue an article of deep conviction, faith, and belief. And arguably in history, the most significant illustration is William Wilberforce, who could easily have been the Prime Minister of Great Britain, but instead at a young age committed his entire life, and it ultimately killed him, to the abolition of slavery. I have been to Washington, DC, probably close to 30 times now in my working life. And my staff will tell you, my former staff will tell you, that no matter how tight my program, there are two places I always go, even if it's just for 10 minutes at each one. I go to the Holocaust Museum to remind me of the depths to which human beings are capable of descending in certain circumstances. And then I go to the Jefferson Memorial. And I look up to that promissory constitutional note that Jefferson wrote to the Americans that's yet to be fulfilled, which inspires not only them, but should also people like us. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there's something else that I've learned in those many visits to those two places. Socrates in Plato's Republic in 400 BC said that the root of all evil is ignorance. And it is, as I just said to you, the source of much of human misery and pain, and prejudicial thinking and ideas and closed minds. But it isn't just education. At the Holocaust Museum, I often look to Reinhard Heydrich, the director of the Protectorate of Moravia and Bohemia, who chaired that meeting in Wannsee, that outer Berlin suburb, in January 1942. 13 of those ministers and senior public servants that attended that meeting signed off on the final solution. Within a year of that meeting, half of the Jews, political dissidents, homosexuals, Roma and Gypsies were dead. 9 of those 13 had the best university education Europe had to offer, PhDs, master's degrees. It isn't just education. It's also a values-based education and the formation of character. I grew up in Launceston in northern Tasmania. My father used to go away to sea, was a marine steward. My mother, until I was 10, was a stay-at-home mother and then worked as a doctor's receptionist. In the 13th year of my life, my father took me for a walk down the street in which we lived, which was very unusual. And he said to me, son, look at the houses. I'd seen them a million times before. I mean, but you didn't know what you were going to get. He tried to explain the facts of life to me 2 months earlier in a boat in the Tamar River fishing. So, there was a lot of weird stuff coming my way at that age. But he said to me, son, your mother and I don't have any money. We don't know influential people. He said, the only way you're ever going to live in a better house than the one you're growing up in is if you work as hard as you can at school. At the time, I had no idea what he was talking about. A couple of months later, they put that house on the market and they moved to Adelaide, where he'd grown up. They couldn't afford to live in Hobart, which was more expensive. And just before we moved, he lost his job. There was a downturn in the shipping industry. He was unemployed for the best part of 2 years. My mother was a devout Irish Catholic. My father was a very committed non-Catholic. The deal was that he got the politics and my mother got the religion. So I'd been educated by Christian nuns, Christian brothers. But we went to Adelaide and I went to a very good public school. I went to Modbury High School. And then in the early part of what is now year 11, I went back to my father, who was then back at work, and I asked him if I could go back to a Catholic school. I didn't know what I was missing. I couldn't put my finger on it. Anyway, he persuaded, on his third attempt, persuaded the Jesuits in Adelaide to take me into the school. Initially, they'd refused on the basis the school was full and the year 11, if you like, school certificate as it was 3 or 4 weeks already commenced. What happened to me in those 2 years changed my life and laid the foundation for the person I am and the things I've been able to do. For those of you who don't know the Jesuits, they're a seriously above average intelligence militant subfaction of the Catholic priesthood. They've got their guy at the Vatican at the moment, so presumably they're a bit more relaxed. But the Jesuits taught me that a life of success would be built on 4 things. The first, they said, is commitment. You have to consistently apply yourself to whatever it is in which you believe and whatever cause or endeavour to which you have committed yourself. As Churchill and others have said, you don't give up. The second, they said, is conscience. Every decision that you make has a question beneath it. What is the right thing to do? And no such thing, they said, as big or small decisions. Every decision has consequences for you and for others. And what I've observed over the years, and you will have all seen it, you get people who'll really be focused on a particular decision they've got to make. They put an immense amount of effort into it. You know, this is really important, Brendan. You know, I'm putting a lot of time into this. And then be dismissive of other decisions as if they're unimportant. Send them off to others without supervising the outcome. And invariably, they're people that get into trouble. The third, they said, is compassion, about which Neville Bonner had spoken to the Liberals. It literally means to share another person's pain. That's the literal interpretation of compassion. But what I've found in leadership is knowing what a person thinks is important. So it's important that I know what Richard thinks, for example. But what's much more important is I understand how he thinks. Once you are imbued with the imaginative capacity to see the world through the eyes of others, then you are more than halfway there to working out how to challenge and change their attitude or their position. And so through much of my life, whether practicing medicine and all the other things I've done, I'm often having to sum people up. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sort of way, but I'm having to work people out. Where are they coming from? How does he or she shape their worldview? Who's pushing their buttons? So, and often you're having to do it quite quickly. So when Bill Kennard walks into my office in Brussels and he sees what I've got on the walls or what I've got on my desk, I'm telling him something about me and what drives me. And so in reverse, that is really, really important. The fourth thing that they said is courage. Nothing of value in life is achieved without taking a risk. And if you think of the people that are successful, whether it's in business, whether it's in the arts, culture, whatever people are doing, they will have taken risks, not cavalier risks, calculated risks. And courage is it's a spirit that challenges doubt in all of us. It's like, when you're a kid and you're on that diving board, will I jump off or won't I? There's a doubt. Is this the right thing to do? Courage also imposes will. It protects your integrity, advances your values, and it also ultimately inspires you to break through fear. When I finished school, I didn't know what to do. I actually failed year 11 narrowly. I dropped all the physics and chemistry and the stuff I didn't like and wasn't particularly good at, and instead did European history and English and other things that I particularly liked, and biology, and surprised everybody by doing quite well. And I didn't know what to do, so I initially enrolled for an economics degree at Adelaide University. And by the end of the first term, I thought, this is not for me. I'm going to end up being a public servant or an accountant, both very worthy careers, one of which I've already had. And my parents obviously were devastated. I didn't know what to do. So I worked in a department store. I got a job at Harris Scarf, and I worked at the basement in Rundle Mall. And I used to sell doors and curtain fittings and worked with three wonderful women that I thought were very old. They were probably in their 40s at the time. And it became very useful because later in my political career, when I was knocking on doors and I got an abusive person opening the door, I could say, oh, madam, that's a beautiful Sorrento door you've got. Or I could offer some advice on curtain fittings and drapes and things like that. But I spent a year working there and weekends at a hotel and thinking about it. And it seemed to me that the people who end their lives with the greatest sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in some way have spent it in the service of other human beings. So whatever you do with your life, to find ways of advancing the interests and welfare of others. So in the end, I applied for medicine. I got into that. And in my intern year, which was the first year after the 6-year degree, I had a life-changing experience. So it was a Saturday afternoon. I was working at a major teaching hospital, the Flinders Medical Centre in Adelaide. And I was on call, amongst other things, for the paediatric surgery ward. So I got a call to go up there, and I went into the ward, and the charge sister of the ward asked me if I would write up a pethidine infusion. Pethidine is a drug like morphine, a narcotic, for a 3-month-old baby that had what's called a Nissen fundoplication. It's an operation to stop severe reflux from the stomach back up to the throat and into the lungs. Now, my basic training and instincts was that you didn't give narcotic infusions to children under the age of 12 months. But I looked at this woman and I thought, well, she's had 30 years experience in this. She's forgotten more than I will ever know. So I agonized over it. Anyway, I signed the order. So about 3 hours later, my beeper went off. And in those days, if someone wanted to call you from outside the hospital, your beeper went off. You went to a phone, you rang the switchboard. So the call came through. I think I've still got tinnitus in my right ear from the volume of the person on the other end. It was the surgeon, John Freeman. I'll leave the expletives out of it. But basically, he said to me, what on earth were you thinking, you imbecile, and other things? The only defense I had was the charge sister told me to do it. From that day on, every decision that I have made has been mine. In hindsight, some of them I got wrong, but I have never since been placed in a position where the only defense for what I did was that someone told me to do it. Instead, I've been able to explain the basis of my decision-making, the advice that I sought, from whom I sought it, and hopefully learned from the mistakes that I have made, and I will continue to make, no doubt. I was practicing medicine in Hobart in the late 80s. And I was running 2 emergency medical services with David Crean, Simon Crean's brother, a doctor, magnificent family, wonderful people. And I was angry. I was angry with the government. The federal government at the time was running a crusade attacking the medical profession, the incomes and privileges of doctors, all that sort of business. And I was angry with the Australian Medical Association that I felt was completely inept in actually representing me and my friends and colleagues to society and standing up to this government. So I decided that I would get active in the AMA. And I was at my third meeting in Hobart, and it was a rainy night, and there are about 30 doctors at this thing. And there was no discussion whatsoever of the attacks on the profession. And I got up and I asked the chairman, I held up the front page of the local paper, and it said that the average GP was earning $130,000 a year. I mean, I was working an 80-hour week. I wasn't earning that sort of money, so I obviously needed a better accountant. But anyway, he said to me, look, a neurosurgeon he was, he said, Brendan, these politicians come and go. It's a passing parade. He said, but we are committed to our patients. We're in this for the long haul, and it's just best that we ignore them. So I sat down and I turned to the fellow next to me and I said, right, that's it. If it's the last thing I do, I'm going to get wherever I have to get and do whatever I have to do to change this organisation. Now, at the time, I had what's called a number 2 haircut. I had an earring. I didn't own a suit. I'd been a member of the Labor Party in my teens. I had a very questionable background to take on reform of a very conservative organisation. But I was also of the conviction that if you, as Ida Bell said to young Neville, if you treat people with decency and courtesy and express yourself well, surely you must be able to make a difference. So I threw myself into it and cut a long story short. So in 1989, I had been driving reform at the AMA there for about 12 months. I had received death threats in relation to a campaign that I had been running against the corporatisation of medicine in Tasmania, quite serious death threats, which I had managed to record. And the person responsible was subsequently charged and convicted. And this had got the attention of a doctor in Sydney, a man called Dr. Bruce Shepherd, who was described in the British Medical Journal as an avuncular right-wing orthopaedic surgeon, which deeply offended Bruce because he regarded himself as much more right-wing than that. And in the mid-80s, he had led the surgeons and all the specialist proceduralists out of the New South Wales hospitals over a matter of principle. They wanted to be paid nothing for treating public patients and in return be able to have their private patients in the public hospitals. So a friend of mine, this is in Hobart, Bruce Shepherd's come to Hobart, it's 1989. A friend of mine said to me, oh, mate, I'll introduce you to Bruce. And I said, well, that wouldn't be a good idea. So anyway, he took me up, he introduced me to Bruce. And I said to him, how do you do, Dr. Shepherd? You represent everything in the medical profession I don't like. You've given us a particularly bad name. I'm on a reform agenda, and I'm going to do everything I possibly can to marginalise you and people like you. Now, I thought he'd say 2 words to me, the first of which would be get. But instead he said, look, he said, I've been watching you. He said, you're going to go a long way. The medical profession desperately needs people like you. He said, when you get to know me, then tell me what you think about me. He said, but the first piece of advice I'm going to give you is never pass an opinion on someone you've never met. And I was quite disarmed by that. And we did become good friends. He became a mentor to me in many ways. And he gave me a lot of advice, some of which I took. In 1993, I was elected, I was only 33, but I was elected unopposed as the president of the Australian Medical Association, the federal president. And what I found in leadership, amongst other things, is what informs leadership is vision. So management is about emptying an inbox, an in-tray, making day-to-day, week-to-week decisions. But what informs leadership is vision. You have to give people a comprehensive sense of where you're going, why you want to get there, what's going to have to be done by all of us to achieve that vision. Vision is like a campfire. It's something around which you sit. It warms you. You're reflecting on where you've been, who you are, and where you're going to go tomorrow. And so I articulated a vision for the medical profession, which was not just industrial and professional, but a broader vision where the profession would be an advocate for broad societal interests in a whole range of public health areas, crusading with what I called an activism of caring to get the tobacco industry out of sport, to get the tobacco industry out of print and television, crusading against the Tasmanian government, which then proscribed as illegal homosexual relationships, to see environmental issues as health issues. I took television crews and media through remote parts of Aboriginal Australia to bring the existential challenges of Aboriginal health to middle-class lounge rooms. And in fact, I remember my very first meeting with the then Health Minister, Graham Richardson. I raised 4 issues, and Aboriginal health being one. And he said, mate, he said, I've spent a lifetime reading polls. He said, concern for Aboriginal people is not in the top million issues worrying the voters. So I was still relatively naive, and I said, oh, really? I said, well, can you give me some time? I'll see what I can do about it. So I joined the AMA for the wrong reasons and got active. But once I got involved, I realised how power can be used in certain ways to challenge and change the attitudes of society, to give voice to those who don't have any. So one of the other things in leadership is you concentrate also on people, policy, and the structure of your organisation, or your business, or whatever it is. So I was setting about reform of the organisation, and I rang Bruce Shepherd to get his views. Bruce Shepherd had preceded me as the federal president of the AMA, and I was concerned about a fellow in a senior position in the bureaucracy. And I asked Bruce his view of him, and Bruce said, yeah, mate, he said, you're right. He said, he's never bled for anything. And I said, I beg your pardon, Bruce. He said, he's never bled for anything. He said, mate, you have to surround yourself with people who are possessed of 2 qualities. The first, he said, you've got to find people that believe in something enough that they will bleed for it. Whether you share their cause or not is less important than the fact that they actually care about something enough that they're going to bleed for it. The second, he said, you've got to find people that are over-enthusiastic. He said, much more important to have to hose somebody down a couple of times a day than stick ginger up their bums to get them moving. And so I made a decision in late 1994 that I would not get any more done unless I actually tried to get into Parliament. And it's a long story, but I sold my house in Hobart. I moved to Sydney because I felt the country was run from Sydney principally, and I knew what politicians did in marginal seats, very important work, getting pension checks to turn up, the electricity turned back on. But my interest was also in where the country's going. And so through, again, a big risk-taking, I was privileged to be pre-selected by the Liberal Party and then elected to represent the electorate of Bradfield in the Upper North Shore of Sydney. Just before Christmas in 1997, I received a book from a constituent. So in politics, people cease to be human beings, they're constituents. So the book is by a German philosopher and physicist, a man called Bernhard Filbert. It's called Revelation. It's a very heavy theological read about how people effect and manage change institutionally and individually. He said, progress leads to chaos if not anchored in tradition. Tradition becomes rigid if it does not prepare the way for progress. But a perverted traditionalism and a misguided progressivism propel each other toward a deadly exodus, hardly leaving any ground between them. And I wished I'd read it before I become the president of the AMA. At my first national conference as AMA president, having just been elected, I said to the members of the association, I said, AMA, it should stand for against most anything. I said, because here we are, a group of men and women dedicating our lives to discovering and understanding the causes, origins, treatment, and prevention of disease. But when it comes to public policy, we simply oppose everything. And then when change inevitably comes, defend that change against the next one coming down the line. And what Phil Birth articulates there is the challenge that you all have in your businesses, that I have now at Boeing and I've had in the various leadership roles I've had. You've always got a group of people who are traditionalists. They're conservative. They want tomorrow to be like today, next year to be like this year. What's critically important, I've found, is that you need to understand, to not just know what the traditionalists think, but to understand how they think, to understand the values, the sacrifices, and the motives and vision of those who gave your organisation what it has and made it what it is. Once the traditionalists believe that you understand and respect them and what's important to them, then you're able to articulate a vision of reform and change, reassuring them that the future is going to be built on the fundamentals that are important to them. At the other end, you've got progressivists. You've got people who seemingly often just want change for its own sake, who often neither understand, let alone respect, the values of the traditionalists. And to a large extent, at times, they need to be hosed down. But in every organisation, you need a bit of both. The other thing that I've found that's important is an observation you make of human beings is obviously we're all different. Some are salmon. Some of us are salmon fighting our way up the fjords of life. We're ambitious. We want to do more. We want to achieve more, hopefully for others as much as for ourselves and our families. And then you've got others that just want to find a quiet pond in the world, whether it's in a retail store or a university department. And you need all of these people. It's not to suggest that any one is better than the other. When I was, and I'll finish shortly so you can ask me questions, but I was in Brussels and I was in my, starting my third year. It was early 2012. And Julia Gillard was Prime Minister, and the Gillard government asked me if I would extend my posting from 3 to 4 years. They love me being overseas. And I said to the minister, I said, look, thank you, I appreciate that. But I said, I think 3 will be enough. We'd had a major transformation in our relationship with the European Union, and we'd got to the NATO table with influence and a formal structure for having it. And I said, if I do 4 years, I think I'll just be doing the third year again. What I've found is when I get to a point in my life where more than 70% of what I'm doing this year is what I did last year, that's when I start to think, is it time for someone else to come in with a new set of eyes and time for me to find another challenge to take on? I'm one of the 7. So I said no. And then I said to my wife after that, because at the time people were asking, they say, Brendan, when you go back to Australia, what are you going to do? I didn't know. And I was approached by others offering various things. I said to my wife, whatever I do when I go back to Australia, I want to do something meaningful. I feel that the taxpayers have invested a lot in me and that I've got more public service in me. I didn't know what. I've often said to young people over the years, the best way to get the job you want is to concentrate on the one you've got. And even if you don't like the job you've got, to make everybody around you believe by your actions and your commitment to it, that it's the best job you've ever had and the only one you ever wanted. So about a month after the discussion with the minister, I got a call from the Chief of Staff to the Veterans Affairs Minister back in Canberra. And he wanted to talk about Anzac Day and various things. So we went on to talk about a number of other things. And I found out quite by accident that the job as the director of the Australian War Memorial was up. And there was controversy because they had advertised the job, and controversial because they were happy to have a non-military non-historian, run the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Now, of all of the things that I did in Brussels over my 3 years, it wasn't advocacy to heads of state or the people at NATO or negotiating major treaties with the European Union or anything. It was the time I spent in the cemeteries in Flanders, in Belgium, where there are 14,000 Australians buried, half of them with no known grave. I went to the Menin Gate, the magnificent arch over the medieval wall around the city of Ypres, where there are 55,000 names of the missing engraved, including 6,192 Australians. An hour and a half drive from Brussels. I went there. I didn't count them. They told me they did. I went there over 74 times. I told them I would have gone there every single night if I could, where they play the last post at 8 o'clock. That's what meant the most. So anyway, I applied for the job. I had 2 interviews with a headhunter. At the end of the second interview, she said to me, Dr. Nelson, I have to be honest with you, you're not going to get an interview. And she went on to say, you've now got no experience with museums, and we've got a highly credentialed field of candidates, and so on. Well, firstly, I was disappointed. Secondly, I was angry. And I said to her, look, we're both being paid by the taxpayers. You've wasted effectively an hour and a half of your time and mine. You could have told me that in the first 10 minutes. So anyway, I was very disappointed. I moved on from it. And then at the NATO summit in Chicago that year in 2012, Julia Gillard actually said to me, as Prime Minister, she said, Brendan, I just want you to know I'm very happy about the War Memorial. I didn't know what she's talking about. And she told me that she understood I'd applied for the job. She was happy about it. So anyway, short story, I get called back for an interview. So I go to the interview panel, and there's a lesson in this. So one of the people on the panel said to me, Dr. Nelson, do you know much about museums? I said, no. I said, I've visited a few. He said, well, have you ever run a museum? And I said, no, of course not. You know that. I said, if you're looking for an expert, my advice firstly is not to. But I said, I've been in this position before. I said, as I understand it, there are 300 people who work at the Australian War Memorial. Because he had said to me, he said, look, we've got a highly credentialed field. We've got some people that have run major international cultural institutions. Why on earth, he said, would we appoint someone like you to run the Australian War Memorial? And I said, well, you've got 300 experts, as I understand it, at the War Memorial. They've forgotten more than I'll ever know. I said, but I've learned something about experts from my time in the medical profession through everything I've done since. They see the world through a straw. And this job, as I understand it, will be to not simply manage the memorial, but to be a leader of it and ambassador for it. And the key task in these roles is the application of intellectual rigor to the process of exercising judgment, drawing on all of the expertise that's both within it and outside it. And the rest of them were nodding in approval. And then subsequently I was recommended and appointed to the role. And as a non-expert at the memorial for 7 years, I know it sounds terribly conceited, but I would come in every day and I'd say, I've had an idea. Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And in the first 12 months, the most constant refrain I got, oh, we've never done that before. And so it was, again, the traditionalists and the progressivists, but it was a question of remaining true to the vision of its founder, to ensure that I understood, respected the traditionalists, and reassuring them that the new things we were introducing, the new ways of telling stories, were very much based on the foundations which they had built. Just a couple of other things in finishing. In that, there's a Hall of Memory at the Australian War Memorial. Since 1993, the unknown Australian soldier has been interred in it. There are 15 stained glass windows that stand sentinel over that grave. And each one is a depiction, it's an image of an Australian from the First World War. And at the bottom of each one is a single word. The founder of the memorial, who was the official war correspondent, landed at Gallipoli, stayed with the Australians at the front through the entire war, wounded 3 times, refused evacuation, was witness to the whole thing from start to the armistice. And John Trelaw, the first director, he was a veteran of Gallipoli in France. They asked themselves a very important question. They asked themselves, what are the qualities What are the values we saw in these Australians, which we regard as being essential, not just for victory in battles, but for depth and breadth of character? And character, about which I spoke with Neville Bonner, derives from the Greek word. It means the impression left in wax by a stone seal ring. The Greeks called it the stamp of personality. Those 15 qualities: resource, to dig deep, to find every human and material resource you might have available to you to help you achieve your objective. Candor, to be open and honest. Good leaders are people that are authentic, transparent, and will tell their story and share their story with those whom they seek to lead. Devotion, and that's at the foot of a nurse. She looks directly down Anzac Parade. You've got to completely subsume yourself, as the Jesuits said, into the people and the cause to which you've committed. Curiosity. Successful people are curious. They're always asking questions, probing and prodding. The Australians of the First World War would not uncritically accept the orders they were given. Independence. You've got to know when to stand aside from a mob. Comradeship. We have this expression, mateship, that spirit that binds us as Australians in the face of adversity. And at a place called Passchendaele in late 1917, Charles Bean was witness to 38,000 Australian casualties in 8 weeks. There were 35 Australians dead for every metre of ground that was taken, in the mud, the blood, and the slime. And he wrote of the Australians that he observed that wherever they went, they were sustained by belief in themselves and in one another, whether their own death or the end of the world would come. Patriotism. Ancestry. You never forget who made you who you are and gave you what you had. Loyalty. Then chivalry, which was a quality seen in the airmen of the First World War. They regarded the chivalric codes of medieval knights of courage, honour, integrity, courtesy, a sense of justice, and most importantly, a willingness to help others, whatever the cost to yourself. Coolness and control, restraint, knowing when not to speak and when not to act is often far more important than the alternative. Audacity or courage, which I've already discussed. Decision, we've got to make them, we've got to be responsible for them. I've observed in my life, good leaders are people that are at ease with themselves. There's no sense of self-aggrandizement. They're not, as my son would say, they're not up themselves. They're people that are clear-minded, ethical, and decisive. They're motivated by a sense of duty to the organisation and to the people whom they lead and those whom they serve. They're people that have an open mind, a mind that's open to new ideas, who are willing to have their inherent biases and prejudices challenged by others, and they're open to other people. There are also people that wear humility as comfortably as the trappings of the office that they have. They have that sense of self-restraint. They have wisdom, which is the capacity to penetrate the circumstances of people and situations in which you're in. Energetic, work hard. No one's ever going to work harder than you do yourself. And they're also people that make others feel a reverence for themselves. But one of the things you observe, there are people that manage up. You know, they treat people above them with immense respect and all that, and then will treat with disdain the person who's answering the phones or vacuuming the floors and so on. Every single person should feel a reverence for him or herself by those who lead. I've worked over the years with many, many people. I've worked with some magnificent people. I've also worked with a very small number that frankly I despise, but they'll never know. Because your key task is to find out what everyone's got to offer and get them to put their oar in the water at the same time. Sometimes you've got people that you just have to get out of the boat. And in my experience, if you have serious doubts about somebody, you need to deal with it early. You will only regret it if you don't deal with it early and let it go on. And finally, in terms of success, as I say, you've got to have an open mind. You've got to nurture the inner integrity of your own intellect, your ability to think, articulate ideas, to read. One of the most important publications, I think, that I'd recommend to people in leadership who aspire to be is to read The Economist every week. It covers all of the major political, geopolitical, business, economic, cultural issues that are happening throughout the world. You don't have to read the whole thing, but one of the key things is to be an interested person, interested in the real world, and to be interesting to other people. Character, as I said earlier, to have this imaginative capacity to see the world through the eyes of other people. And the other thing is the humanity with which you deal with others. In the end, you're not going to be remembered for the person who was the head of company A or company B or whatever. You are going to be remembered, and your legacy will be the way in which you treated other people and how you enhanced the lives of others. The great 17th century Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant said, "Every human being is an end unto himself and not a means to be used by others. Respect for your own humanity will be found in respect for humanity for others, and morality is freedom." So I'll leave it at that, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brendan Nelson. As always, first class presentation. Really appreciated your thoughts. You're talking to an audience at the moment, and we're all New South Welshmen here. I think just about everybody I'm seeing on the participant list. I think there may be a couple dialing in from Melbourne. You're obviously spending a lot of time working from home. I think to the business people or the family owners that are listening to you this morning or this afternoon now, what's the one piece of advice? You've obviously, you've been on the government side, you're in business today. What's the one piece of advice you'd offer them to, I think, everybody in New South Wales at the moment, probably going through this year, what is probably a tougher year, more so than maybe last year?
Well, Richard, I don't know if there's one piece of advice. Most fragile yet powerful of human emotions is hope. We all have to believe that tomorrow is going to be better than today. Next week's going to be better than this one, and next year's going to be better than the one we're in. And what most sustains it is men and women who reach out in support of one another, irrespective of the adversity and the circumstances in which you find yourselves. So we're all in this boat together. And as you know, some are doing it much more comfortably than others. Some businesses are booming, others are dying and struggling to survive, and everything in between. But what, to me, is what I find, which you spoke about resilience at the start, what I find is every day I ring some of our staff, and they might be, and I don't mean ringing the managing directors or anything like that. I do speak to them regularly, of course, but I ring people that are doing jobs that are at the lower classifications in our company, and I can't tell you what it means to them. And I'm focused on single people who are living alone. I'm focused on women that are homeschooling and working in 2 time zones, and seeking to remind myself that whatever frustrations I have nothing to complain about. Richard, I realise I'm going on, but you asked me a simple question. Just to remind everybody, when I was at the War Memorial, I became acquainted with hundreds and hundreds of stories of Australian men and women and what they've done in our uniform over more than 100 years. I think most of you would have heard of Weary Dunlop, the surgeon on the Burma Thai Railway, and quite rightly he was revered and respected, but there were others. And one of them is a man called Kevin Fagan. He was a surgeon, he was on the Burma Thai Railway, he was a member of the 2nd 10th General Hospital. Russell Braddon wrote a book about Changi. It's called The Naked Island. And he wrote this about Kevin Fagan. He said, above all, there was the extraordinary courage and gentleness and the incredible endurance of Medical Officer Major Kevin Fagan. Not only did he treat any man needing treatment to the best of his ability, he also carried the men who fell. He carried the kit of men in danger of falling. He marched up and down the whole length of the column throughout its entire progress. If we marched 100 miles through the jungle, Kevin Fagan marched 200. And when at the end of the night's trip we collapsed and slept, he was there to clean blisters, set broken bones, render first aid, and bury the dead. And all of it he did with the courtesy of a society specialist being richly paid for his attention, and the ready humour of a man who's not tired at all. He's the most inspiring man I've ever met. Some 20,000 British and Australian troops share my view. In 1946, Kevin Fagan, who came back from it, survived. He wrote about his experiences for the Medical Journal of Australia. And he said this. He said, "It gave me a great understanding of men, a great appreciation of ordinary things in life. Bread and butter, a bit of jam on your toast in the mornings, a glass of beer when you're thirsty, and the value of human relations. You know, when it comes to an end, the only thing that really matters are the people whom you love and the people who love you." And so in resilience, in my experience, you have to reach out and nurture the relationships with the people you really care about and perhaps whom you love and who love you. You also need to create an environment where, in this case, your employees, those with whom you work, feel that they're part of a family, a community led by somebody who cares about them and knows and understands them. And the third thing, which is above our collective pay grade, is we've got to live in a society which gives us a sense of meaning and purpose to what we do. So there you go, Richard. I should have been a priest, mate.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer, and thank you for the quote. I might just go into the audience to see if maybe there's one question from the audience, and I'm not sure. Hopefully this technology holds together, and if there's a particular question, we might take a question from the audience. So I'm not sure whether we can actually get this to work. We'll give it a go. We can. Is there anybody from the audience that would like to ask a question, please? And we're going to try and see if we can do this. No, we're all good? No, no questions. No, we're good. I suppose the comment that I'd just like to probably ask you to finish on, if there was one thing that you would say, sorry, got that? No, there was one thing that that you wanted to share with Australian business owners from this presentation that you've done today, what would be the one thing that you would ask us all to remember, please?
I think it's the adversity, it's the things that don't go well and how you deal with them that really determines the value of your life and what you're doing, much more so than any success. And as Neville Bonner observed, those things that he endured, and we all endure to varying degrees, hopefully nothing like he did, that all of those things you can turn into events which determine what you will do with your life and how you deal with it. And in my relatively privileged life, the frustrations that I've had, the setbacks I've had at times, I've turned into goals to make me more determined. This is an extraordinarily difficult environment we're going through. And, you know, when you think about it, you know, we're, as a group of people, Australians, we've been through and we've seen crippling drought. We've seen the impact on so many Australians and indirectly the rest of us. We then saw bushfire with immense loss of property, loss of human life. We then, in some parts of the country, had hailstones, floods. We get a pandemic, and we're also looking at a political class that, to some extent, has been failing us. This has been an extraordinarily challenging and difficult time. So in terms of that resilience, Richard, as I said, as Kevin Fagan said, it's in the end, it's the people whom you love and who love you. And the best way to, I think to get through it is to draw on, to give of yourself to others and to draw on all the resources from others that you care about. So I know it seems strange. And by the way, just in finishing, in Boeing, obviously it's a very big company. So I'm a country president and executive chairman here in Australia. So I'm part of the global leadership group, if you don't know what I mean. So I've had to give, so I learned that part of my responsibilities, which I'm happily discharge, is that I participate in providing leadership presentations to Boeing employees throughout the world in a virtual thing like this. And the first one I did, I shared with 2 other people in my position in other countries. The first 2 had a whole bunch of slides, and they were basically running through the business in those countries and the P&Ls and all of those things, which is really important. And then I come on and I've got not a single slide. I've said to young people over the years, the more slides people have, the less confident I am that people know what they're talking about. The more people that come to a meeting, the less confident I am in the veracity of whatever it is they want to talk to me about. And so I turn up, I've got no slides. And of course, I talked a lot about the sort of themes I've spoken to you about, and then talked about the business and the business strategy in Australia. But the reason I say this to you, and I've said to, and one of the liberating things in life is getting to a point where being sacked is not the worst thing that happens to you. So it doesn't worry me. I just want to do what I think is right. And I've said to the leadership of our company, I said, look, we're risking producing a generation of middle management that can't communicate unless they've got a slide. And also, it's the technical stuff, all the stuff you deal with, your fights with the tax office and dealing with your accountants and your P&Ls and staffing and workplace relations issues, all of that, it's hard. But that's the easy part. The harder part are what are they called, these soft skills. Who you are, how you relate to people, your capacity to think of new ways of doing things, to overcome obstacles. They're the things that really inform leadership. And in my experience, for me, once I have confidence in people, so once I've got the right CFO or I've got the right manager of infrastructure or something like that, once I'm confident in that, then I concentrate on the things that I think I need to be doing. So, sorry, Richard, you just triggered me there, and I thought I'd just offer that at the end.
Once again, on behalf of all of us, Dr. Brendan Nelson, it's been an absolute privilege to have you. Thank you so much for your time. We wish you best of health and success in your current role with Boeing. And hopefully we'll see the planes flying sooner rather than later in Australia. Thank you,
Richard. And if anyone wants to communicate with me, Richard knows how to get to me. I'm happy to help in any way. And given you're with Coraggio and your small and medium-sized businesses are getting very, very big, when you're ready to buy a plane, I'm here for you.
Thank you, Doctor. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan.